Welcome back, and we are with the director of the Bureau for Economic Research, Professor Johan Kirsten. He's talking to us about land reform, land restitution, and the best way to handle this difficult question currently in South Africa of land restitution, whether to do away with the constitution or not. The earlier question you asked was why the state was very slow. People say, you know, we don't have much to show for it. 60 billion rands down the line, there's not much to show. So, and where will the money come from anyway if you're going to be acquiring land using the market as a benchmark?
Yeah, that's precisely the point. And the counter argument, or the point that we're trying to make as well, is that the private sector also has a duty, because the issue of going through this whole reform process and maintaining existing property rights and maintaining the existing inequality is not the way to go. So there's a duty on the private sector to assist the state in a way to not spend the whole budget on land reform, because it's not possible. Or in any case, the budget for land reform is very small. So the argument that we posted in one of the articles is that there's a duty for agribusiness, the financiers, farmers, to actually come forward and actually be more proactive in terms of delivering of land to the market. Because they sit with the land, they cannot actually think that they can continue this way. There's a duty, a moral responsibility, I would argue, for people that have acquired land through this poor system of apartheid and discriminatory system of apartheid. We need to think about how to change that and use the private sector to do this. So the argument is, how do white farmers put up land for redistribution process? And the National Development Plan is quite clear and provide a nice recipe for how that should happen. The question is, we should activate that. And the recent discussions with the farmers and Deputy President Mabuza has already sort of, in a way, dealt with the argument that we put up front, is that the private sector can do it successfully, but they must upscale the effort together with the state. And there's always this mistrust between the private sector and the state, and I don't understand why that is the case.
Well, I think I understand. It's because there's no one who's speaking clearly on what should happen. I think that's the problem that we face. So we're talking largely about agricultural land. But, you know, land ownership in South Africa is also defined in various ways. You've got traditional communal land managed differently. The contracting and rights there are different from where somebody buys their own property, something else there. And of course, land in the urban areas,
which is the fundamental issue. And I would argue that the urban issue is the bigger issue. And an interesting point that the EFF leader has made recently is the argument, what is Human Settlements Department doing about the issue of urban land, improving our housing, densifying our housing, bringing people closer to the workplace? Those are all dimensions that are critical in this broader land reform debate, which for me is a difficult issue, because I'm not the expert in urban dimensions, but I can see that that's where the big conflict is.
So let's be practical then, because you've not only spoken about this, but you've also proposed ideas. How do you see the partnership of private landowners in the agricultural sector together with that of the government and emerging farmers work out? And we can throw in the traditionally owned lands as well. Just tell me about the models that you've been working on.
Yeah, so it's conceptual and probably hypothetical, but it builds on the National Development Plan and say that farmers, agribusinesses need to come together with beneficiaries in a district land committee, not with government officials, because they often constrain the process. They identify land for sale, land that can be allocated to beneficiaries, and then they should finance that process together with a land reform fund that is in the land bank that carries very low interest or zero interest, because it's state funding. But you need to repay the money, but it can be repaid through the private sector or through a joint effort. Mentorship is very important. Support is important. The support is coordinated, that farmers get access to the inputs, to the finance, to the tractors, to the livestock. And many of the settlement programs that we've implemented in South Africa in the 1940s and the 1950s were magic, how they went through a process of farmer X buy the input, put up a fence, buy a new cow, and claim back the money from the state through a commitment.
So the farmers then enjoyed state support.
Enjoyed state support.
Yep.
So we need to bring that level of state support back to make sure that the land is effectively utilized, productively utilized, and actually contribute to growth. So the other part of the model is that we should provide incentives, and that's a key part of the argument, is that if the state, often small-scale farming is a very important dimension of helping new farmers to establish, but water is a critical component of this. So water infrastructure, water rights will help those communities to be settled in small-scale basis, but the water right can also be the incentive for the commercial farmer to sell off a part of his land and subdivide it for smaller farmers. So he can intensify, the small farmers are established, they produce commercially, and everybody's better off. So you can, with a small
The problem is what? That people do not have access to this money.
Yeah, and they're fragmented, and they're different departments and different categories, and the PFMA makes it difficult to allocate the funding to the various beneficiaries. So probably the best is to put them in one pot and then have a very quick turnaround to access those funding.
But now, Prof, an argument can be made, I can imagine it's going to be made, that look, what you, Wandile and other commentators are suggesting is tinkering with the system. That let the state expropriate all land without compensation. And then let's take it from there. And by all land, I include that which is in the urban areas. So, you know, what's your argument against that?
So our argument takes the line of the ANC resolution, and the point of view of the president is that land reform should be an orderly process. That's very important for stability, for growth. There's need for expropriation in certain conditions. That should happen, should be happening effectively. But the reality is, if we want to maintain the principle of property rights, which stretch from land through to other dimension, commercial property, etc., and we want to secure investment, we want to attract investment worth $100 billion, then we need to make sure that we do this orderly. So our argument, which might could be considered as tinkering on the existing system, should be upscaled to a level whereby the private sector and the state actually take hands and use the state funding and the state mechanisms to get a recognition that these guys are doing the job for us. The systems are in place, the finances are in place, the networks are in place. They're all probably dominant, white controlled, but that's the way that you actually get them to do the job for the state.
And what do you think we're likely to see if that were to be adopted? Because again, an argument can be made that this is an effort to delay the struggle
and
of
that's
land
why
expropriation.
The carrot and the stick approach is very important. The carrot is the incentives, the recognition, and then the stick is, if it doesn't happen quickly, then we need to go to the expropriation without compensation as one of the instruments for redistributing land.
And is there land in South Africa that's lying idle that you believe maybe should be expropriated without compensation?
Minor parts. There could be idle buildings in the cities, and there could be land around the fringes of the cities where it's very difficult to farm without being stolen to death. So those are land that probably is idle that can be used for productive purposes. But if you look at normal rotation systems, it looks idle, but for sustainable farming you need to rotate your land from one year to another year to make sure that there's grazing or there's production and so on.
From where you're sitting and having consulted with different groups of people, very brief response from you, how quickly do you think this matter should be resolved?
Very quickly. I have hoped that when we started the process back in 1994, we would have been resolved by mid-2000s, but now we sit with this delayed process, a slow delivery, but it needs to happen in the next 5 years.
Next 5 years. Prof, thank you very much for having been our guest, and we appreciate your time with us here.
Pleasure. It was nice being here.
Much appreciated. Well, there's a lot of thinking around the land question. And of course, public hearings have been held and the expectations are many out there, but there are different types of land ownership in South Africa, by the way. And we're focusing largely on agricultural land and the support that should be given to small-scale or emerging farmers, and how the existing big-scale farmers can cooperate with the state to make sure that agricultural sector is secured, as well as the investments made into the sector, that they remain stable. That's all we had for you this evening. And thank you for joining the Mudisa Network. And be sure to tune in next week, Sunday at 6 p.m. from us. Good night to you.